So this show today is dedicated to Dean Jones, a marvelous player, someone who is iconic in India for various reasons. And all cricket fans, many of us who've actually seen him play, miss him. The suddenness with which he went was pretty devastating. There was a massive outpouring for Dean Jones. So that he was a multi-layered personality, going beyond his cricket. He came in as a commentator. He became Professor Dino in India, and he was a much-loved man. Obviously, the outpourings that have come in from all over the world has been tremendous for Dean Jones, because it brings out the man who has a lot of layers to him over and above the cricket that he played, the knowledge of his game, the humor that he brought in as a commentator. Of course, he paid for it at times, we know that. But people loved Dean Jones. It is my pleasure to have with me Michael Sexton, who came over to India for the Ekamra Sports Lit Fest to unveil his book, Borders Battlers, which was written on the Chennai Test, the second tied test in cricket history. I read the book cover to cover. I saw the match, incidentally. And the best part about that book was we all know what the outcome was, but Michael wrote it in such a way that it reads like a thriller. He's done quite a lot of other books on cricket, knows the game very well. Michael, how are you doing?
Well, it's a sad time, isn't it, to reflect on the life and times of Dean Jones, taken far too young from us, only 59 years old. And I think what we found in Australia in the last week is that he was so popular with people. He inspired people to love cricket, the way he went about playing the game. And I think that's been what has impressed me most. A number of people who've said he was my hero, or when he came into bat, the energy lifted in a match. And you know, I guess he may not have even realised the importance that he had, given at times he was critical of the amount of international cricket he played. But there was almost two parts to him. One was this amazing, charismatic one-day international player who kind of reinvented the game a bit. And then there was this second innings that he played in the Chennai Test, the double hundred, to great personal, health issues he had as a result of that. The two different parts of Dino and here. There are many sides to him, but those have been some of the things, I guess, which have been pouring out in this country since word came through of his death.
Michael, I want to focus quite a bit on the book that you wrote and about the Chennai Tide Test, the numerous people you spoke with. Of course, the innings that Dino played was heroic. The 210 odd runs that he made under very hot and humid conditions, it really cost him a lot. They put him on a saline drip later. He even said many years later that when the temperature hits 37 or 38, he gets involuntary shivers because of the hammering his body took, the way Alan Border pushed. Moments that you can recall while you were researching the book, what they said about Dino and what made him go on and on and on in that brutal heat and humidity of Chennai.
Yeah, it's very interesting because he'd come into the team. Australia was really at a very low ebb on that tour. They had lost a number of very good players in Dennis Lillee and Greg Chappell and Rod Marsh to retirement. Then there had been the Rebel Tour to South Africa, which had split the group, the playing group. Alan Border felt very much alone as captain. He was very much the senior player, and he was looking to rebuild a team around him. They'd been to New Zealand and they'd played poorly there, and Wayne Phillips had broken his finger, so wasn't available for the Tour of India. And Dean Jones came in as his replacement. So he was far from an automatic selection at that point. He played 2 test matches prior to that in the West Indies and had not had a great return. And even when he got to India, in the warm-up games, he wasn't really pushing his case for selection. A lot of the other players were making runs. And there was Boone and Marsh were very young. There was a very young Steve Waugh. So there were some good players around him. But Australia was looking for a number 3 to go into that first test match. They had Border at 4, and he didn't want to come up the order. And they had Marsh and they had Boone opening. And Alan Border called Dean Jones into his room the night before the match, and he said, I want you to be number 3, and I want you to think about the players who played for Australia in that position. Think of Ian Chappell, think of Don Bradman. And Dino says he walked out of that room feeling like he was Superman. But this was his career in Test cricket on the line. That's why it was so important to him. And that's why he had to make it work. And that's why he pushed himself so hard. And ultimately why Alan Border pushed him so hard as well.
Michael, moving on in his career, he after that the Chennai Tide Test, he came back and he was a very significant one-day batsman in the first ever World Cup that Australia won in 1987, I think, and he transformed himself into a magnificent one-day batsman. The way he ran between the wickets, even Ravi Shastri recalls and says that it was Olympian in nature. He redefined hitting, which is now so rampant in the T20s and the IPLs and what have you. But those were very early times, and it was Dean Jones who came in at number 3 and then later got labeled as easily the finest white ball batsman in the world. What do you think of that?
He was very athletic. He was very fit. He was very fast. And in fact, in the Tide Test, they had this problem with he and Boone because Boone couldn't keep up with him. He would take off in that heat. And they worked out a little system between each other, which was to rotate the strike. This was one of his Dino's innovations as well, which was don't get bogged down. And he knew that if Boone looked like he was going to paddle one down the leg side, Dino would take off running because he knew that was a signal for a quick single. And for Dean Jones, it was to hit the ball through mid-wicket and Boone would start running. And this was how they worked it out. And of course, one of the great unknown questions about the Tide Test is when Alan Border famously said to him when he was 174 and Jones was sick and he wanted to come off the field, and Border challenged him in a most brutal way. And he says, well, if you're weak, go off. But if you want to be an Australian, or words to that effect, you will stay here. And he was so tired that in a sense they were turning twos into ones because he was playing with no energy left. It was totally contradictory to how he plays a one-day player, which is all energy. And I think Phil Tufnell summed it up. Phil Tufnell made his debut for England in a one-day game at the SCG. And he describes, as he arrived at his delivery stride, Jones was running down the pitch toward him. And he didn't know what to do. And in the end, he went through with the delivery and he says the ball went past him like an artillery shell. And he actually fell over on his back in the middle of the pitch. And such was the aggression of Jones. And that's how he played the game. And that's what he brought to one-day cricket. And I can only imagine what he would have been like at T20 cricket for the same reason. But he thought about the game very deeply and he had this natural athletic ability. And if you look at the Australian team, it didn't always have that. Boone maybe, Taylor not so much. Border, these were not athletic players in the way that Jones was. And that's what he brought, particularly the one-day arena.
Reading a lot about Dean Jones, I get a sense that at some point in time, he felt done in by the Australian Cricket Board. He played 52 tests, he hit 1100s, he had an average of 46 plus, which is superb in test cricket, yet he was dropped. He was again shabbily treated in the ODI team, and when he was dropped for the South Africa tour, he announced his summary retirement from cricket completely, which was more a show of disgust than anything else. It probably taught a young Steve Waugh how to manage his exit and learn from that, because by that time, simultaneously, as we all know, Alan Border was also retiring. But my main question is that if someone was this good with this kind of average in Test cricket, who was labeled as the finest ODI batsman of his time, why did the Australian Cricket Board treat him the way they did?
Oh, that's an excellent question. They started to develop an embarrassment of riches around that time. You'll remember that they set up the first cricket academy, which was based here in Adelaide, and it became a factory for players. So you started to have Steve Waugh, and then Mark Waugh came along, and then you had Darren Lehman making a ton of runs all the time, and then you had a lot of New South Wales were pushing players through all the side, and they were always looking, and Bob Simpson was always looking for the next young player to come through. Greg Blewett came and went in that time. He made a century on debut and then a second century against England and South Africa. So there was an embarrassment of riches at that time. And I think Dino, in part, was a victim of that. He was also very brash and he was very outspoken. And, Bob Simpson has said that he estimates that when they were on tour, at least once every 2 weeks, he'd have to pull Dean Jones aside and kind of say to him, look, just just bring it down a bit. Your enthusiasm and your excitement and your extroversion can irritate people in a small group. So whether or not that played into it, I don't know. But it was a time when Australia just had a factory. I mean, Ricky Ponting was coming through the system. Michael Slater was coming through the system. There was a number of players around. And suddenly, Dean Jones started to look a bit older and one thing and another. And look, he wouldn't be the only one like that. I know Mark Waugh's exit was not how he'd wanted it. David Boone didn't go the way he wanted. Michael Slater certainly didn't. So it's a common problem. But in answer to your question about why the Australian Cricket Board treated him that way, I'm not entirely sure.
There are moments of Dino's career which generate, humor for us, but may not be for him and for Australia. But the most famous incident is when in the Benson and Hedges series, he was facing Curtly Ambrose and he asked him to take off his white wristband because he thought he couldn't see the ball well. And it was delightful watching a clip years later with both Curtly and Dino speaking about that incident. And Dino says, I don't know why the hell I did that. But he did it with an intent to wind up Curtly Ambrose, and to what effect the guy took 5 for something and completely wrapped up the match. I, personally speaking, as a fan of Dino, I don't see it as a mistake. He obviously tried to wind up the big man and it didn't work. But that is typically Dino. How do you see it?
Exactly that. I think he was an extrovert. And remember that Dean Jones came, his father, Barney Jones, was a fierce competitor in club cricket in Victoria, playing for the Carlton Club. And he'd grown up in this atmosphere. And he was aggressive and he took it on and he wanted to do that. I suspect it was a little bit of a brain fade. And I know the rest of the Australian team weren't that thrilled when he stirred the West Indies bowlers up. But don't forget, there was a similar incident with less humour in it, perhaps, when Steve Waugh went nose to nose in the Caribbean with the West Indies as well. And the Australians had also, at a time when they were not doing well against the West Indies, had decided to bowl short to Viv Richards of all people, which could be a recipe for disaster. But it was part of a mindset, which I think Border originally was trying to bring in, which was, you've got to stop being pushed around. And certainly that was part of the story of the Tide Test in Chennai, was that, as Dino said at the end of that, the 200 he made was now what was expected of Australian players now. You can't just get away with smaller amounts. Listen, you have to push yourself right to the end. And that's what Border was trying to build into the side. And I think he really liked that in Jones, that Jones was a bit chest out and that he would say to a bowler, you take your wristbands off, even if it is going to cause a problem down the track. That's the way he was. There's a tremendous story from state cricket here, which I might tell you. Dean Jones was a very fierce parochial captain of Victoria. They were playing a game on the Adelaide Oval against South Australia, and they were up against David Hooks, who was captaining South Australia, who was also a fierce parochial performer. And Hooks was fielding at first slip, and he noticed that Jones was going further and further down the track to bat to a bowler called Andrew Zessers, and he was trying to hit him off his line because Zessers had a nice outswinger and he was trying to get further, and he was making a lot of runs. And in the end, they cooked up this plan, which was they made a signal for a certain delivery that Zessers would bowl very wide, so wide, in fact, that Hooks would come forward from first slip, take the ball and throw at the stumps. The plan worked perfectly, and Dino was about 1.5 meters outside, and he turned around and he just looked at Hooks with that look of, yeah, you got me. That was good. Well done. And he went off the field. And that was kind of, I think, the spirit. He was an opportunist. He was enterprising. He wanted to make the game fun. And I think for people like you and I, he gave us so much entertainment value. And the episode with the wristbands probably just all part of that.
There are players, Michael, who have a problem with authority. They might be brilliant in their own way, but they are not subservient. They are aggressive. And like you rightly said, that Bobby Simpson had to sort of rein him down. And probably after Bobby, there was hardly anyone to say that to him. AB in his own way would have, I'm sure. But if you look at his record, he had problems with Derbyshire in England. And then he also had problems with authority in Victoria. It also boiled down much later to his career that after he retired as a player, he had applied for a coaching position in 2 Melbourne clubs, but they all went to different other players. So did he become some kind of social pariah there? Were people afraid of taking Dino on, thinking that, he might inflict more damage, or because of his eccentricities, have an entire new generation coming up who would be more in your face?
It may be. I wouldn't be sure why he didn't get those positions. He was a very, and I say this in a kind way, he was a very loud man in the sense that he had opinions, he expressed them. I suspect he wasn't particularly concerned about criticism that came his way, and he would say exactly what he thought. I mean, for those of us who love the game, it was a terrific, because he used to write fantastic columns in the Melbourne newspaper in The Age. But he was also not afraid to say when he didn't like someone and the reason why he didn't like them. I'm not sure that he ever clashed particularly with Bobby Simpson. But I do remember when he was playing county cricket in England once, and came across him to interview him. And it was a very wet day and he wasn't doing anything. And he spoke at length for an hour maybe of all sorts of theories about the game. I remember one of his famous phrases was, he said that this game will bite you in the bum. It bites everyone in the bum sooner or later. And he said, oh no, except for one. There's only one, meaning Bradman. But this is how he would talk, and this is the opinions. Now, I suspect there may have been some in those change rooms who might have been listening to him talk for an hour and got a bit tired of the sound of his voice. I don't know. But that was who he was, and he was always true to himself. One of the things Ian Chappell always says about cricket is you have to know yourself first of all. You have to be true to yourself. And I think Dean Jones was true to himself. He played the way he spoke, and he spoke the way he played. That was who he was. Now, if that cost him positions, I don't know. But I suspect there would have been some who may not have liked the way he went about things, and he certainly would say the first thing that was in his head.
You've done a book on Ian Chappell, and before the Chennai test happened, Dino had sought out Ian's advice, and Ian Chappell in his column on Dino very fondly remembers that meeting, and he said he told him what he had to. Do you see any similarity in the two characters?
Certainly in terms of strength of purpose, very much so. Different style of batsman perhaps, but certainly understand the game, understand aggression and going after the runs, and you're there to entertain. I mean, had with Chappell said to him, you've got too many shots. You put a few away for later. And, Chappell himself famously early on was urged to stop hooking in the 72 tour in England, but ignored that advice. I think they're both headstrong, but I think they saw something of themselves in each other. And it is part of that. Test cricket's a very tough game. It really is. It tests people physically and mentally and emotionally. And I think they recognise in each other that you have to be strong and you have to be hard. And that's what Jones showed, particularly at Chennai, with the double 100. But I think he and Chappell were cut from the same cloth.
There is a quote by Dino, which goes like this, and I quote, "Sometimes I die by the sword, but by G, I had a few kills along the way." That is so typically Dino.
Isn't it? And he's, we will always remember, won't we, those one-day international matches when he would walk out to the crease, and he would almost strut out, wouldn't he? And he would come out to the crease and he would look around and he had that look on his face of, you know what, I'm going to unleash something here. And that's pretty exciting to watch. And that's the image I always remember of him.
His 145 at the Gabba against the touring English in 1990 is rated as also one of his finest innings because of the way he played that knock. Also went over the ropes repeatedly, charged the bowlers. He didn't care whether they were pacers or spinners. And in that strutting that you talk about was also a lot like Viv Richards, because both had that swagger, both had their own style, and he had that zinc cream on his lower lip with that floppy hat and all the style that came into it. Any thoughts about that 145 at the Gabba?
And it was at a time when Australia was not scoring a lot of runs. So again, it was refreshing. I mean, England had Botham bowling, had Willis bowling. Australia was really struggling in that series. And it had been said also, the Australian time around that period was quite an introverted one. Particularly Alan Border, who was a very introverted captain. Players talk about coming into the team and it would be weeks before he would even speak to them, for example. And Dino was different from that. That's why I think he, and you're right when you said before about it, he failed a few times, but he had a few kills along the way, and that's kind of how he was. It wasn't reckless about the way he went it, but he was going to make something happen one way or the other. Certainly that happened at the Gabba that time. And I suspect if anything, he may have regretted was that he could never get that consistency at Test cricket, where those innings would come on a regular basis, which probably would have cemented his number 3 spot for Australia, and he left himself vulnerable. So for every one he played at the Gabba, there was probably a 5 at Perth that he could have got more. But that's every cricketer, isn't it? But you're right about the Gabba innings. It was a time when Australia didn't have that flourish of excitement, didn't have that Viv Richards character, which other sides had. And Dino was that for Australia in that match.
You mentioned his father, Barney Jones. I tried to dig up something about him. I couldn't get much information, but besides the fact that he was a highly competitive Carlton Club cricketer, Ian Chappell mentions Barney Jones also. Any information about Barney Jones as a player and any kind of impact that he may have had as his father on Dino?
Barney Jones, as I know of him, is that club cricket in Melbourne is pretty fiercely competitive, and Carlton are one of those clubs that's pretty fierce. And I'm trying to think now, names escape me, but there was an English cricketer who came out to Australia to play a season with Carlton. And he said Barney Jones and the Carlton Cricket Club was the fiercest group of competitors at any level of any cricket he'd ever played. He said they took no prisoners at all. And Keith Stackpole was from that club, and he became a great mentor of Dean Jones. So I think that's where a lot of these guys come from. And again, I will reference Chappell here because I do know a little more about him at club level. But his father, Martin Chappell, was a ferocious player for Glenelg in South Australia. And the boys came through learning that system. And, Ian would score when he was a 12-year-old or 13-year-old or run the scoreboard. They were brought up on the traditions of that. And that's what Dean Jones was very much brought up on that with his father, Barney. And I think that also Barney, there was an element of ferocious on the field and also always looking for an angle, always looking for a little way to win the game, always thinking of something different. There is a famous story, which I'm not entirely sure of the details of, but it was to the effect that they had a drink session one Saturday night after day's play, which may or may not have involved some of the ice from the esky falling onto the pitch, which may or may not have made things a little bit difficult for the team batting next. But that may be speculation. But what I'm getting at is Barney was part of that culture, which was about analysing the game and playing it ferociously and looking for the angles. And I think that's what Dean Jones brought in as well. And that's why I think he was such a good commentator too, because he had a lot of theories and a lot of things he was thinking about. And that was, perhaps where it all grew up with him.
As a coach, he was one of the few people who went into Afghanistan when things were not still right. And some reports say that he even escaped a suicide bomb attack when he was in Afghanistan coaching the team, probably in the year 2017. He also went to Pakistan later and really helped them and their sides in their local leagues. He even went to South India and was a commentator there for the local league. So talking about Pakistan and Afghanistan, it seems very evident that Dino didn't care much about the comfortable life sitting in an air-conditioned comm box, heavily paid. Quite a few of our former Indian players just do that. They don't want to coach. They don't want to go and take the heat any longer. There's a sense of criticism also that many of the greats don't even want to give anything back to the game. Dino was very unlike that. And he went out and tried to do stuff and leave an imprint. Do you think Australia missed a beat by not picking him up as a coach?
Yes, I do. I think his timing may have been out in terms of when the positions were available, and I include that also with commentating in this country. I think he's better known as a commentator on the subcontinent than he is in Australia, which seems peculiar, but that's what it is. I think Australian cricket could have very well done with him as a specialist coach, as a mentor, because he had that confidence. Again, they talk about the confidence to go and bat. And you can knock some of that down, but it's hard to build it into players. And he just had that natural aura. He loved the subcontinent. I mean, he was the first former player who I can remember in this country saying, Virat Kohli is the best batsman in the world. And that was something that Australians didn't always necessarily want to hear. And he said, I'm telling you, this guy is the best batsman in the world at all formats. And this was long before Virat had probably earned that title. So he knew the game in the subcontinent. He loved India. He loved coaching over there. And I thought he was always brave, I suspect, and strong in his conviction about the game that, as you said, he went to Afghanistan and Pakistan. They really championed the 2020 tournament there in Pakistan. And these were things that not every Australian was seeking to do. And I thought it was a real show of his belief in world cricket and also the universality of it, you know, the international nature of it. And I think it is a shame that Australia didn't tap into that, that he could have found a place.
Michael, my last point is about Dino as a commentator. Yes, we all know about the Hashim Amla incident, and I heard that remark. I just thought that he was just trying to make a joke out of it. There was nothing personal. He apologized to Hashim Amla later. Yes, I know that this was shouldn't have ever been said. He did pay a price for it, but he was adopted more by Indian television, by news channel in India. Then later he got reinducted. But listening to him as a commentator, I always felt that he was a perfect balance between the humor, which was never overdone, with his deep insight, and some of the demos he did in the dugout were pretty much fascinating, because he would pick up the bat and show how a particular delivery should have been played, or talking about a perceived weakness of a batsman and what that person should do to erase it. You made a very important point that he became a big name in India as a commentator, not so much in Australia. But specifically the legacy of Dino as a commentator, how would you like to sum it up?
Well, I hope that his legacy as a commentator would be that one, that he brought knowledge to the game, which he had bags of. But secondly, he brought an enthusiasm for the game, which would be very, very much in keeping with his personality and very much in keeping with the way he played the game. He did have a summer out here where he was on radio, and he used to commentate alongside Greg Matthews. And you can imagine what that was like. Greg Matthews used to call him Jonah. And of course, without getting too far into it, Greg Matthews famously said that he doesn't rate the 200 at Chennai because it was a flat wicket. And he said Dino was young and fit. And he said we should get over it. But that's also Greg Matthews stirring the pot. It was wonderful hearing the two of them together and the respect they had for each other, you know, what they'd been through together. But Matthews, although he made a lot of fun and jokes about Jones, whenever Jones would say something about batting or about bowling or field positions, it would go quiet because you wanted to hear what he had to say. Because there was also an element of how can the game be better? And that's what I would hope that Dean Jones's legacy might be as a commentator, that he told us all about the game and he also showed us a way that it could be better.
Right, Michael, we'll wrap this up now. And thank you very much for your time. It was very interesting listening to you bring in a completely different perspective on Dean Jones. Dino, as he's lovingly known, we will all remember him, miss him. But before I wind up the show, I would certainly like to end this show as a tribute to Dino with that famous quote of his, which says, "Sometimes I die by the sword, but by G, I had a few kills along the way." We'll miss you, Dino.
Thank you.
Thanks.